I don't care who you think you are, but this lounge is for real passengers, not wannabe influencers with fake tickets.
The words sliced through the refined atmosphere of the Platinum Elite Lounge like a knife through silk, delivered with the kind of cold precision that comes from years of practice. Vivian Blackwood stood behind her marble-topped reception desk, like a fortress commander defending her territory, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against the surface as she sized up the young man standing before her with the kind of dismissive glare usually reserved for unwanted solicitors or lost tourists who had wandered into the wrong part of the airport. It was 2:30 on a humid Friday afternoon at Atlanta International Airport, and the lounge was buzzing with the usual mix of business executives, international travelers, and frequent flyers who had earned their way into this sanctuary of luxury through miles status or the simple act of paying for first-class tickets. The space itself was a testament to modern elegance, all polished chrome and rich mahogany, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the busy tarmac where planes taxied like metallic birds preparing for flight. The air carried the subtle scent of expensive leather mixed with the aroma of freshly ground coffee and the faint hint of designer perfume that seemed to cling to everything in spaces like this. But right now, all of that careful ambiance was being shattered by the tension radiating from the reception area where Vivian Blackwood was making it abundantly clear that she had no intention of allowing 18-year-old Jalen Mitchell to set foot inside her domain, regardless of what his boarding pass might say. Vivian was the kind of woman who commanded attention the moment she entered a room, not just because of her striking beauty, but because of the way she carried herself with an air of absolute authority that seemed to suggest she had never encountered a problem she couldn't solve or a person she couldn't handle. At 42, she had maintained the kind of figure that turned heads and inspired envy. Her blonde hair styled in a perfect bob that never seemed to move, despite the constant activity of her job. Her makeup applied with the precision of someone who understood that appearance was power and presentation was everything. She wore a tailored navy blazer that hugged her curves in all the right places, paired with a crisp white blouse that was unbuttoned just enough to be professional, yet alluring, and a pencil skirt that emphasized her long legs and the confidence with which she moved through the world. Everything about Vivian Blackwood screamed success, from her expensive watch to her designer heels to the way she held her head high as she looked down at people she deemed beneath her notice. She had worked hard to get where she was climbing, from her humble beginnings as a flight attendant to her current position as manager of one of the most exclusive airline lounges in the country, and she wasn't about to let anyone forget it. This lounge was her kingdom, and she ruled it with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove, maintaining what she called standards with the kind of zealous dedication that would make a religious convert proud. Standing on the other side of that marble counter was Jalen Mitchell, and if you didn't know better, you might have dismissed him as just another teenager trying to punch above his weight. At 18, he had the kind of lean build that came from playing basketball in high school, though he'd given up the sport to focus on his studies during his senior year. He wore a simple gray hoodie that looked expensive if you knew what to look for, but ordinary if you didn't, paired with dark jeans and white sneakers that had seen better days, but were still clean and well-maintained. His backpack was slung over one shoulder with the casual ease of someone who had spent years navigating airports and long flights, and there was something in his posture that suggested he was used to being underestimated. But if you looked closer, really looked, you might notice the subtle signs that there was more to Jalen Mitchell than met the eye. The hoodie might have looked simple, but it was cut from expensive cotton with stitching that spoke of quality rather than mass production. The watch on his wrist was understated, but had the kind of weight and craftsmanship that suggested a price tag most people his age couldn't afford. His backpack might have appeared worn, but it was made from premium leather that had been designed to look better with age, and the way he carried himself suggested someone who was comfortable in his own skin despite being surrounded by wealth and privilege. Right now, though, none of that mattered to Vivian Blackwood, who had taken one look at Jalen's appearance and skin color and made the kind of snap judgment that she would later claim was based on experience and intuition, but that any reasonable person would recognize as something much uglier. She had seen young black men in casual clothes before, had watched them try to talk their way into spaces they didn't belong, and she had developed what she considered to be a sixth sense for spotting trouble before it could disrupt the carefully maintained atmosphere of her lounge. Ma'am Jalen said, his voice steady and polite despite the insult that had just been thrown at him. "I have a boarding pass for flight SB 447 to London, first class seat 2A. I'd like to access the lounge while I wait for my flight." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, the screen displaying his mobile boarding pass with all the relevant information clearly visible. The Skybridge Airlines logo prominently featured along with his seat assignment and the confirmation that he was indeed entitled to lounge access as a first-class passenger. But Vivian didn't even glance at the screen. Instead, she tilted her head slightly and gave him a smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind of expression that managed to be both condescending and dismissive at the same time. "I'm sure you do, honey," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of fake sweetness that was somehow more insulting than outright hostility. "But see, we've been having some issues with our system today, and I need to verify that you're actually supposed to be here before I can let you in. You understand, right? We have to protect our legitimate passengers from any kind of disruption or confusion." The words hung in the air like smoke carrying implications that were impossible to ignore. Around them, other passengers were beginning to take notice of the conversation, their attention drawn by the tension in Vivian's voice and the careful way she was speaking, as if she were dealing with a potentially dangerous situation that required delicate handling. A businessman in an expensive suit glanced up from his newspaper, his expression curious but wary. An elderly couple paused their conversation about their upcoming vacation to listen. A young woman with perfectly styled hair and a phone in her hand looked over with the kind of expression that suggested she smelled a story brewing. "What kind of verification do you need?" Jalen asked, and there was still no anger in his voice, just a calm patience that spoke of someone who had dealt with situations like this before. "I have my boarding pass, my ID, and my passport if you need additional documentation. I'm happy to provide whatever you need to confirm that I'm supposed to be here." Vivian's smile grew wider, but there was something predatory about it now, like a cat that had cornered a mouse and was taking its time before pouncing. "Well, you see, anyone can fake a mobile boarding pass these days. It's surprisingly easy with the right software, and we've had several incidents recently with people trying to sneak into the lounge using doctored screenshots and stolen confirmation numbers. So what I really need is for you to step aside while I call our security team to run a proper background check and verify that you actually purchased this ticket, rather than just downloading it from some website that specializes in helping people get access to places they don't belong." The accusation was delivered with such casual confidence that for a moment the other passengers might have believed that this was indeed standard procedure, that Vivian Blackwood was simply doing her job and protecting the integrity of the lounge from potential fraud. But there was something in her tone, something in the way she emphasized certain words and looked at Jalen as she spoke, that made it clear this wasn't about procedure at all. This was about power and control and the kind of assumptions that people like Vivian made about people like Jalen based on nothing more than the color of their skin and their age. "I bought this ticket with my own credit card 3 weeks ago," Jalen said, and for the first time, there was an edge to his voice, a hint of the frustration that was building beneath his calm exterior. "I have the email confirmation, the receipt, and the charge on my bank statement if you'd like to see any of that. But what I don't understand is why you need all of this additional verification when all you have to do is scan the barcode on my boarding pass and confirm that I'm who I say I am." Vivian waved her hand dismissively, as if the very suggestion that she might be wrong was too ridiculous to consider seriously. "Like I said, honey, anyone can fake those things these days. What you're showing me could be completely fabricated, and I'd have no way of knowing until our security team does a proper investigation. Now, I'm trying to be nice about this, but I really need you to step aside and wait while I get this sorted out. There are real passengers waiting to check in, and I can't hold up the line for someone who might not even be supposed to be here." It was then that the businessman in the expensive suit decided to insert himself into the conversation, rising from his leather chair, with the kind of authoritative movement that suggested he was used to having his opinions heard and respected. Robert Henderson was the kind of man who had spent his entire career in boardrooms and first-class cabins, traveling for business more than pleasure, and accumulating the kind of frequent flyer status that opened doors and commanded respect wherever he went. He was in his 50s with silver hair and the kind of well-fed appearance that spoke of expense account dinners and corporate entertainment, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never been told he didn't belong somewhere. "Excuse me," he said, walking over to the reception desk with measured steps. "But I couldn't help overhearing your conversation, and I have to say I've been flying with Skybridge for over 20 years, and I've never seen this kind of verification process before. If this young man has a first-class boarding pass and proper identification, shouldn't that be sufficient for lounge access? I mean, isn't that how this is supposed to work?" Vivian turned to face Robert with a completely different expression, her hostile mask melting away to reveal the kind of warm professionalism that she reserved for passengers who looked like they belonged in spaces like this. "Mr. Henderson," she said clearly, recognizing him as one of her regular customers, "I completely understand your concern, and under normal circumstances you'd be absolutely right. But we've had some security issues recently with people using sophisticated fake documents to gain unauthorized access to the lounge, and management has instructed us to be extra vigilant about verifying the authenticity of boarding passes, especially when they involve passengers who don't fit our typical demographic profile." The phrase "typical demographic profile" hung in the air like a slap, its implications so obvious that even Robert Henderson, who had lived his entire life insulated from the kind of discrimination that Jalen faced on a regular basis, couldn't help but understand what Vivian was really saying. The businessman's expression shifted, his eyebrows drawing together in a frown as he looked from Vivian to Jalen and back again, processing the reality of what he was witnessing. "Are you saying," Robert asked slowly, his voice careful and measured, "that you're subjecting this passenger to additional scrutiny because of how he looks, rather than because of any actual evidence that his documents are fraudulent?" Vivian's composure slipped for just a moment, her eyes flashing with irritation at being challenged by someone whose opinion actually mattered to her. "Of course not," she said quickly, her voice rising slightly in pitch. "This has nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with security protocol. We've received specific intelligence about fake boarding passes being used by certain types of individuals to gain unauthorized access to premium facilities, and we have a responsibility to our legitimate passengers to ensure that only authorized individuals are allowed into this lounge." But even as she spoke, her eyes kept returning to Jalen, scanning his appearance with the kind of obvious calculation that made it clear exactly what kind of certain types of individuals she was worried about. Her gaze lingered on his hoodie, his skin color, his youth, and the way he carried himself with a quiet confidence that she clearly found threatening in someone who didn't look like her idea of a first-class passenger. Meanwhile, other passengers were beginning to take notice of the confrontation, their conversations trailing off as they turned their attention to the drama unfolding at the reception desk. A young woman with a phone in her hand was watching intently, her thumb hovering over her screen as she debated whether this was worth recording. An elderly couple whispered to each other in concerned tones. A family with small children looked uncomfortable, the parents clearly trying to decide whether they should intervene or simply mind their own business. The atmosphere in the lounge was shifting, the comfortable bubble of privilege and exclusivity being punctured by the ugly reality of what was happening right in front of everyone. This wasn't supposed to happen in places like this, in spaces that were designed to insulate wealthy travelers from the unpleasantness of the outside world. But here it was raw and undeniable, forcing everyone present to confront the kind of discrimination that many of them had never had to think about before. Jalen stood through it all with remarkable composure, his hands at his sides, his voice calm and steady, despite the humiliation he was being subjected to in front of dozens of witnesses. He had been in situations like this before, had learned through painful experience how to navigate the assumptions and prejudices of people who looked at him and saw a threat rather than a human being. But that didn't make it any less infuriating, any less degrading, or any less wrong. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Vivian directly while maintaining eye contact in a way that was respectful but firm. "I understand that you have security concerns, but I've provided you with valid documentation, and I'm willing to provide additional verification if needed. What I'm not willing to do is submit to treatment that you wouldn't apply to any other passenger simply because you've made assumptions about me based on my appearance. So, I'm going to ask you one more time. Will you please scan my boarding pass and allow me access to this lounge, or do I need to speak with your supervisor about the way I'm being treated?" The challenge was politely delivered but unmistakable, and Vivian's face flushed with anger at being questioned so directly by someone she had already decided didn't deserve to be in her presence. This was her domain, her kingdom, and she wasn't about to let some teenager with delusions of grandeur tell her how to do her job, regardless of what his boarding pass might say. "Listen here," she said, dropping all pretense of politeness as her voice rose to a level that commanded the attention of everyone in the vicinity. "I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but this is a private lounge for premium passengers, not a public space where anyone can just walk in and demand service. I've explained to you that we need to verify your credentials, and if you don't like that, you're welcome to wait for your flight in the general terminal area with all the other passengers who don't have legitimate access to this facility." To understand how a simple request for lounge access had escalated into a public confrontation that was about to change multiple lives forever, you would need to understand the very different paths that had led Vivian Blackwood and Jalen Mitchell to this moment, and the vastly different ways they had learned to navigate a world that treated them according to assumptions and prejudices rather than their actual character or accomplishments. Vivian Blackwood had been born 42 years ago in a small town in Georgia, where beauty was currency and conformity was survival, where young women learned early that their appearance could open doors that education and ambition might leave forever closed. She had been homecoming queen and prom queen and every other kind of queen that a small southern town could produce gliding through high school on a combination of natural beauty and carefully cultivated charm that made teachers overlook her mediocre grades and classmates forgive her occasional cruelty. College had been a brief experiment that ended when she realized that studying required more effort than she was willing to invest, and that her looks could take her places that a diploma never would. Her entry into the airline industry had been almost accidental, a job application filled out on a whim after a particularly brutal breakup with a college boyfriend who had suggested that maybe she should think about developing some skills beyond looking good in photographs. Flight attendant training had been easy enough, and she had discovered that she genuinely enjoyed the travel, the interaction with passengers, and especially the access to a lifestyle that would have been impossible to afford on a small-town salary. She had been good at the job in her own way, charming enough with male passengers and professional enough with everyone else to avoid serious complaints, and she had quickly learned how to use her appearance and personality to her advantage in an industry where customer service was paramount, and passenger satisfaction could make or break careers. The years had passed quickly in a blur of flights and layovers and hotel rooms, and Vivian had watched her contemporaries settle down into suburban marriages and motherhood while she continued to chase the kind of excitement and luxury that came with a career in aviation. She had married once to a businessman she met in first class, who had seemed like the answer to all her financial concerns. But the marriage had lasted less than 3 years before dissolving in a messy divorce that left her with alimony payments and a bitter understanding that beauty and charm could only take you so far in a world where money ultimately talked louder than anything else. Her promotion to management had come through a combination of seniority politics and her ability to maintain the kind of polished appearance that airline executives believed would reassure premium passengers that they were receiving the level of service they had paid for. The Platinum Elite Lounge at Atlanta International Airport was considered one of the most prestigious positions in the Skybridge Airlines operation, catering to the wealthy business travelers and international passengers who generated the bulk of the airline's profits and demanded treatment that reflected their importance to the company's bottom line. It was a position that suited Vivian perfectly, allowing her to exercise the kind of authority she had always craved while surrounding herself with the luxury and exclusivity that she felt she deserved after years of serving other people's needs and demands. She had transformed the lounge into her personal domain, implementing what she called elevated standards that emphasized appearance behavior and the kind of unspoken codes that separated the truly elite from those who merely aspired to join their ranks. She prided herself on being able to identify potential troublemakers, at a glance distinguishing between passengers who belonged in premium spaces and those who were trying to access privileges they hadn't earned. Over the 15 years she had worked for Skybridge Airlines, Vivian had developed an instinct for reading people that she trusted more than any written policy or official procedure. She could tell if a suit was tailored or off the rack, whether a watch was genuine or counterfeit, and most importantly, whether someone carried themselves with the kind of confidence that came from actual wealth and status, or the nervous energy of someone trying to pretend they belonged in circles that were naturally closed to them. It was a skill that had served her well in maintaining what she considered to be the appropriate atmosphere in the lounge, keeping out the kind of passengers who might disrupt the carefully cultivated environment that premium customers expected and deserved. In her mind, she wasn't discriminating against anyone. She was simply maintaining standards that protected the investment that legitimate passengers had made in their travel experience. First-class tickets where expensive lounge memberships cost thousands of dollars per year. And the people who paid those prices deserved to be surrounded by others who shared their values and understood their expectations. It wasn't about race or class or any of the other divisive categories that people use to create problems where none existed. It was about maintaining the kind of exclusive environment that made premium travel worth the premium price. Of course, if you had asked any of her colleagues or the passengers who interacted with her on a regular basis, they might have told you a different story about Vivian Blackwood and her approach to customer service. There had been complaints over the years, whispered conversations about passengers who had been subjected to additional scrutiny or denied access for reasons that seemed to have more to do with their appearance than their documentation. But those complaints had always been handled discreetly smoothed over by managers who understood that premium customer service sometimes required difficult decisions, and that employees like Vivian were valuable assets who deserved the benefit of the doubt when conflicts arose. Jalen Mitchell's story began in a very different place in a household where excellence was expected rather than extraordinary, and where success was measured not by appearance or possessions but by character and achievement. And at 18, he had already accomplished more than most people twice his age, graduating valedictorian from one of Atlanta's most competitive private schools, while also founding a nonprofit organization that provided technology training to underserved communities and maintaining a perfect record in academic competitions that had taken him to state and national levels. His mother, Diane Mitchell, had built her career through a combination of intelligence determination and an unwavering commitment to breaking down barriers that had kept people who looked like her out of corporate boardrooms and executive suites. As Chief Operating Officer of Skybridge Airlines, she was one of the highest-ranking black women in the aviation industry, responsible for overseeing operations that affected millions of passengers and thousands of employees across 6 continents. It was a position she had earned through 25 years of hard work, strategic thinking, and the kind of political savvy that allowed her to navigate corporate hierarchies that had been designed to exclude people like her from positions of real power and influence. Diane had raised Jalen to understand that excellence was not optional, that he would be held to higher standards than his white peers, and that he would need to work twice as hard to receive half the recognition that others might take for granted. But she had also taught him about dignity, about maintaining his composure in the face of ignorance and prejudice, and about the importance of choosing his battles carefully, rather than allowing other people's assumptions to derail him from his goals and aspirations. She had shared stories of her own experiences. The microaggressions and outright discrimination she had faced throughout her career, and the strategies she had developed for turning other people's underestimation into her own advantage. As a result, Jalen had grown up with an unusual combination of confidence and humility, comfortable in his own skin, but aware that the world would often judge him based on superficial characteristics rather than his actual abilities or achievements. He had learned to dress in a way that didn't draw unnecessary attention, to speak with precision and care, and to carry himself with the kind of quiet dignity that disarmed people who expected him to be either submissive or aggressive. He preferred understated clothing and accessories, choosing quality over flash and comfort over ostentation, understanding that true confidence came from within, rather than from the labels or brands that might impress strangers who didn't know anything about him as a person. His acceptance to Cambridge University had been the culmination of years of hard work and careful preparation, and the trip to London was supposed to be a celebration as much as an interview process. He had earned a full scholarship based on his academic achievements and community service, and the university had specifically recruited him for their international development program, recognizing his potential to make a significant impact in addressing global inequality and social justice issues. It was an opportunity that would open doors to a future where he could use his intelligence and education to make the world a better place, and he approached it with the kind of excitement and anticipation that came from knowing that all his hard work was finally paying off. But even as he looked forward to the future, Jalen understood that he would continue to face the kind of assumptions and prejudices that had followed him throughout his life, that there would always be people who looked at him and saw only his skin color and age rather than his accomplishments and potential. He had developed strategies for dealing with those situations, ways of maintaining his dignity while educating others about their misconceptions, and he had learned to choose his responses carefully rather than allowing anger or frustration to control his actions. The other passengers in the Platinum Elite Lounge that afternoon represented a cross-section of American society, each bringing their own perspectives and prejudices to the confrontation that was unfolding before them. Robert Henderson, the businessman who had initially questioned Vivian's treatment of Jalen, was a decent man who had lived his entire life insulated from the kind of discrimination that people of color faced on a daily basis, but who was intelligent enough to recognize injustice when he saw it, and brave enough to speak up when his conscience demanded action. Maria Santos, the security supervisor who would soon be called to handle the situation, was a 35-year-old woman who had worked her way up through the ranks of airport security through a combination of competence and determination, earning respect from her colleagues and passengers alike through her professionalism and fairness. As a Hispanic woman in a field dominated by white men, she had experienced her own share of discrimination and understood firsthand how it felt to be underestimated or dismissed because of characteristics that had nothing to do with her ability to do her job effectively. Ashley Romano, the social media influencer who was about to become an unwitting witness to history, was a 24-year-old woman who had built her career on sharing her travel experiences with her 2.5 million followers, providing them with behind-the-scenes glimpses of luxury travel and exclusive access to the kind of experiences that most people could only dream about. She had started her account as a way to document her own adventures, but it had quickly evolved into a business that allowed her to travel the world while building a personal brand that attracted partnerships with hotels, airlines, and tourism boards. Thomas and Eleanor Walsh, the elderly couple who had been quietly observing the confrontation from their seats near the window, were retired teachers who had spent their working lives in integrated schools teaching students from diverse backgrounds and witnessing firsthand the impact that prejudice and discrimination could have on young people's lives and opportunities. They had saved for years to afford this trip to London, a celebration of their 50th wedding anniversary, and they carried with them the wisdom that comes from decades of experience, watching how society treats people differently based on characteristics that should be irrelevant to their worth as human beings. Each of these individuals would soon be forced to make choices about whether to intervene, whether to stand by silently, or whether to actively support either Vivian's position or Jalen's right to be treated with dignity and respect. Their decisions would be shaped by their own experiences, their personal values, and their understanding of what was right and wrong in a situation where the power dynamics were clearly skewed in favor of authority over justice. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose the deep-seated prejudices that continued to shape American society in the 21st century, forcing everyone present to confront their own assumptions and biases while determining whether they would be part of the problem or part of the solution. What none of them realized was that this seemingly routine dispute over lounge access was about to become a viral moment that would be viewed by millions of people around the world, sparking conversations about racism, privilege, and the responsibility that all of us have to stand up for what's right when we witness injustice occurring right in front of us. The luxury of the Platinum Elite Lounge with its expensive furnishings and carefully maintained atmosphere of exclusivity was about to become the backdrop for a confrontation that would strip away all pretense and reveal the ugly realities that lurked beneath the polished surface of premium customer service. And at the center of it all were two people whose vastly different life experiences had led them to this moment, where dignity would clash with prejudice, where youth would challenge authority, and where the true character of everyone involved would be revealed for the world to see. The tension in the Platinum Elite Lounge was becoming impossible to ignore, as Vivian Blackwood's voice carried across the elegant space, drawing the attention of passengers who had come here specifically to escape the kind of drama that was now unfolding right in front of them. What had started as a routine request for lounge access was rapidly escalating into something much more serious, and the carefully maintained atmosphere of luxury and exclusivity was being shattered by the raw reality of what was happening at the reception desk. Jalen Mitchell stood his ground with the kind of quiet dignity that comes from years of experience dealing with people who had already made up their minds about him before he ever opened his mouth. But those who were watching closely could see the tension building in his shoulders and the way his hands were beginning to clench at his sides, despite his obvious efforts to remain calm and professional. He had been in situations like this before, had learned through painful experience how quickly a simple misunderstanding could spiral out of control when prejudice and assumptions were allowed to override common sense and basic human decency. Ma'am, Jalen said, his voice still level, but carrying an edge of firmness that made it clear he wasn't going to be dismissed or intimidated. I've provided you with a valid boarding pass, I've offered to show you additional identification, and I've explained that I purchased this ticket legitimately with my own money. What I haven't received from you is any explanation of why I'm being subjected to this level of scrutiny when I can see other passengers walking into the lounge behind me without being questioned about their credentials or asked to prove that they belong here. Vivian's perfectly applied makeup couldn't quite hide the flush of anger that was spreading across her cheeks as she realized that this conversation was not going according to her usual script, where a few pointed questions and implications about security would be enough to convince unwanted visitors to seek accommodations elsewhere. She was used to dealing with people who would back down when faced with authority, who would accept her judgment about whether they belonged in premium spaces, and who would quietly retreat rather than risk causing a scene that might reflect poorly on their character or reputation. "Listen," she said, leaning forward across the marble counter in a way that was clearly meant to be intimidating, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper that somehow managed to carry more menace than if she had been shouting, "I don't know what kind of attitude you think you can bring into my lounge, but let me make something very clear to you. This is a private facility for passengers who have earned the right to be here through their loyalty and their investment in premium travel experiences. It's not a public space where anyone can just walk in and demand service, and it's certainly not a place where I'm going to be lectured about my policies by someone who looks like they should be grateful for any access they're given." The words hung in the air like a slap, their implications so obvious and ugly that even passengers who had been trying to mind their own business couldn't help but turn to stare at what was happening. The mask of professional customer service had slipped completely now, revealing the raw prejudice that had been driving Vivian's behavior from the moment Jalen had approached her desk, and there was no way for anyone present to pretend that this was simply a matter of security protocol or standard verification procedures. Robert Henderson, who had initially tried to intervene with the kind of polite suggestion that usually smoothed over minor misunderstandings in places like this, felt his stomach clench as he realized that he was witnessing something much more serious than a simple miscommunication. As a white businessman who had spent his entire life moving through spaces where his presence was assumed to be legitimate and welcome, he had never had to think about the kind of challenges that people like Jalen faced on a daily basis. But he was intelligent enough to recognize blatant discrimination when it was happening right in front of him. "Excuse me, Robert," said his voice growing stronger and more authoritative as his initial shock gave way to genuine anger. "But what I just heard you say is completely inappropriate and potentially illegal. This young man has provided proper documentation for lounge access. He has been polite and respectful throughout this entire interaction, and you have just made comments that suggest you're denying him service based on his appearance, rather than any legitimate policy or procedure. I think you need to either provide him with the access he's entitled to, or call your supervisor immediately so that someone with actual authority can address this situation properly." Vivian whirled to face Robert with the kind of fury that comes from being challenged by someone whose opinion actually mattered to her, someone whose complaint could actually impact her career and reputation in ways that would be difficult to explain or cover up. She had built her position on her ability to maintain what she called appropriate standards, while avoiding the kind of public confrontations that could draw unwanted attention from corporate headquarters. And now she found herself in exactly the situation she had always been careful to avoid. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled rage, "I appreciate your concern, but this is a security matter that requires careful handling according to protocols that you may not be familiar with. We've had numerous incidents with fraudulent documents and unauthorized access attempts, and management has made it very clear that we're supposed to err on the side of caution when we encounter passengers who don't fit the typical profile of our legitimate customers." But even as she spoke, Vivian realized that she was digging herself deeper into a hole that was becoming harder to escape from with each word she uttered. The phrase, "typical profile," was hanging in the air like an admission of guilt, and she could see from the expressions on the faces around her that people were beginning to understand exactly what she meant by that euphemism. Ashley Romano, who had been quietly watching the confrontation unfold while debating whether it was worth documenting, finally made the decision that would change everything. As a social media influencer with 2.5 million followers, she had developed an instinct for recognizing moments that had the potential to go viral, and everything about this situation was screaming that this was one of those moments where someone with a platform had a responsibility to make sure the truth was captured and shared with the world. She pulled out her phone and began recording her thumb tapping the screen to start a live stream that would immediately alert her followers that something significant was happening. Within seconds, viewers began joining the stream, their comments appearing at the bottom of her screen as they tried to understand what they were witnessing and demanded that she move closer to capture the audio more clearly. "What we have here," Ashley said quietly into her phone, her voice carrying the kind of professional narration that her followers had come to expect from her travel content, "is a situation at the Skybridge Airlines Platinum Elite Lounge at Atlanta International Airport, where a young black passenger with what appears to be legitimate documentation is being denied access, while being subjected to what can only be described as discriminatory treatment. I'm going to document what's happening here because this is exactly the kind of situation that people need to see and understand." The number of viewers on her live stream was climbing rapidly as her followers began sharing the link across their own social media platforms, and the comments section was filling up with outrage and demands for action as people who were watching from around the world began to understand the injustice that was unfolding in real time. Ashley moved closer to the reception desk, holding her phone in a way that captured both Vivian's face and Jalen's, making sure that the audio was clear enough for her viewers to hear every word that was being exchanged. Meanwhile, Thomas and Eleanor Walsh had been watching the confrontation from their seats near the window, their expressions growing increasingly troubled as they witnessed the kind of discrimination that they had spent their teaching careers trying to combat in their own classrooms. As educators who had devoted their lives to helping young people reach their potential, regardless of their background or circumstances, they found it impossible to sit silently while a teenager was being humiliated simply because of his skin color. Tom Eleanor whispered to her husband, "We need to do something. This is wrong, and if we just sit here and let it happen, we're just as complicit as if we were participating in it ourselves." Thomas nodded grimly, rising from his chair with the kind of determined movement that had once commanded the attention of rowdy classrooms and demanded respect from students who thought they could challenge his authority. At 73 years old, he might not have had the physical presence he once possessed, but he still carried himself with the dignity and moral authority that comes from a lifetime of standing up for what's right, regardless of the personal cost. Young man Thomas said, approaching Jalen with the kind of respectful tone that immediately conveyed his support and solidarity. "I want you to know that what's happening here is not acceptable, and there are people witnessing this who will not allow it to continue without speaking up. You have conducted yourself with remarkable dignity in the face of treatment that no one should have to endure, and I want you to know that you have allies here who will stand with you." The intervention of the elderly teacher seemed to galvanize other passengers who had been watching the situation unfold with growing discomfort, and suddenly the reception area was filled with voices as people who had been content to observe from a distance found themselves compelled to take sides in a confrontation that was forcing them to confront their own values and beliefs about fairness and justice. A young mother who had been traveling with her 2 small children approached the desk with her phone already recording, her voice shaking with anger as she addressed Vivian directly. "I have been a Skybridge customer for over 10 years, she said, "and I have never seen anything like this in any airline lounge anywhere in the world. What you're doing is disgusting, and if this is how your airline treats paying customers based on their skin color, then this is the last time my family will ever fly with Skybridge or recommend your services to anyone else." But not everyone was willing to take Jalen's side, and the confrontation began to reveal the deep divisions that existed even among passengers who shared similar economic status and travel privileges. A middle-aged businessman who had been observing the situation from the bar area approached the group with the kind of aggressive confidence that suggested he was used to having his opinions heard and respected in business settings. "Look," he said, directing his comments primarily toward Robert Henderson and Thomas Walsh rather than engaging directly with Jalen. "I don't know what this is really about, but I do know that this lounge has policies and procedures for a reason, and if this young man is having trouble getting access, there's probably a good reason for it. I pay a lot of money for the privilege of using this facility, and I don't appreciate having my travel experience disrupted by people who want to turn every minor inconvenience into some kind of racial incident." The comment sparked an immediate reaction from Ashley Romano, who had been live streaming the entire confrontation and whose viewer count had now climbed to over 100,000 people watching in real time as the situation continued to escalate. "Sir," she said, turning her phone toward the businessman while making sure her followers could see his face clearly, "what we're witnessing here isn't a minor inconvenience or a racial incident that's being manufactured for attention. This is a young man with legitimate documentation being denied service that he's entitled to, based solely on assumptions about his appearance and background. If you can't see the difference between those two things, then you're part of the problem that we're trying to address." The businessman's face reddened with anger at being called out so publicly, but before he could respond, Vivian Blackwood made the decision that would escalate the situation beyond any possibility of quiet resolution. She reached for the phone on her desk and began dialing, her voice carrying across the reception area as she spoke to whoever answered on the other end. "This is Vivian Blackwood at the Platinum Elite Lounge," she said, her tone switching to the kind of urgent professionalism that suggested she was reporting a serious security incident. "I need security to respond immediately to deal with a disruptive passenger who is refusing to leave the premises after being denied access. The individual is becoming increasingly aggressive and is causing a disturbance that is affecting other customers' experience. Please send officers as soon as possible. The phone call changed everything, transforming what had been a dispute over customer service into a potential legal matter that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. Jalen's expression hardened as he realized that Vivian was not only refusing to provide him with the service he was entitled to, but was actively misrepresenting the situation in a way that could result in his arrest or worse. "Ma'am?" He said, his voice still controlled but carrying a warning that made everyone present understand that his patience was reaching its limit. "I want you to know that everything that has happened here has been recorded by multiple witnesses, and your characterization of me as aggressive or disruptive is not only false, but potentially defamatory. I have remained calm and professional throughout this entire interaction. I have not raised my voice or made any threatening gestures, and I have simply asked to be treated with the same respect and courtesy that you would show to any other paying customer." But Vivian was beyond reasoning now, her initial prejudice having evolved into the kind of desperate doubling down that happens when someone realizes they have made a serious mistake but feels too invested in their position to back down gracefully. She had built her career on her ability to maintain control over her domain, and the thought of being proven wrong by someone she had dismissed as unworthy of her consideration was more than her ego could handle. "Security is on their way," she announced to the assembled crowd, her voice carrying a note of triumph that suggested she believed she had won some kind of victory, and they'll be able to sort out this situation properly and restore the peaceful atmosphere that our legitimate customers deserve and expect when they choose to spend their time and money in our premium facilities. The next few minutes would determine whether this confrontation would be resolved quietly or whether it would become the kind of viral moment that changes careers, reputations, and lives in ways that no one present could possibly have anticipated when Jalen Mitchell first approached the reception desk with nothing more than a polite request for lounge access and the assumption that he would be treated with basic human dignity. The atmosphere in the Platinum Elite Lounge had transformed completely from its usual state of refined tranquility into something that resembled a courtroom where multiple trials were happening simultaneously, with passengers choosing sides and bearing witness to a confrontation that was rapidly spinning beyond anyone's ability to control or contain. Ashley Romano's live stream had exploded to over 300,000 viewers as word spread across social media platforms, with people from around the world tuning in to watch what was being described in rapidly multiplying hashtags as a clear case of racial profiling happening in real time at one of America's busiest airports. The comments section of Ashley's stream was moving so fast that individual messages were impossible to read, but the general tenor was clear. People were outraged by what they were witnessing, demanding action from Skybridge Airlines, sharing the stream across their own platforms, and creating a digital firestorm that was growing by the second. Justice for Jalen was already trending on multiple platforms, accompanied by Skybridge discrimination and airport racism. As the power of social media transformed a local incident into a global conversation about prejudice, privilege, and the treatment of people of color in spaces that had historically been designed to exclude them. "This is absolutely unbelievable," Ashley said into her phone, providing commentary for her viewers while making sure to capture every detail of what was happening around her. "We're watching a young black man with legitimate first-class documentation being denied service and having security called on him for the crime of existing in a space where someone has decided he doesn't belong. The manager here has made comments about typical profiles and has completely ignored multiple forms of identification while treating this passenger like a criminal for no reason other than his appearance." The live viewer count continued to climb, and Ashley could see notifications popping up on her screen indicating that her stream was being picked up and rebroadcast by news outlets and social media influencers with much larger platforms than her own. This was becoming the kind of viral moment that could define careers, and she felt the weight of responsibility to document everything accurately while making sure that the truth of what was happening wasn't lost in the chaos of competing narratives and spin attempts. Meanwhile, other passengers in the lounge were pulling out their own phones to record the confrontation from different angles, creating a comprehensive digital record of events that would make it impossible for anyone to later claim that the situation had been misunderstood or misrepresented. A businessman near the bar was live streaming to his LinkedIn network. A young woman traveling with her parents was posting updates to her Instagram story, and even some of the airport employees who had gathered to watch were discreetly capturing footage that they knew would be valuable evidence of what was really happening. Maria Santos, the airport security supervisor who was responding to Vivian's call for assistance, arrived at the lounge entrance with 2 officers and immediately recognized that she was walking into a situation that was far more complex and serious than the typical disturbance calls she usually handled. As a Hispanic woman who had worked her way up through the ranks of airport security, Maria had developed a keen instinct for recognizing when authority was being abused and when protocol was being used as a cover for personal bias or prejudice. She could see immediately that the young black man standing calmly at the reception desk was not exhibiting any of the behaviors that would typically warrant a security response. He wasn't raising his voice, making threatening gestures, or showing any signs of aggression or agitation. In fact, he appeared to be one of the calmest people in the entire area, which was in stark contrast to Vivian Blackwood, who was clearly agitated and speaking rapidly to anyone who would listen about security threats and disruptive behavior. Ma'am Maria said, approaching Vivian with the kind of professional courtesy that she extended to all airline employees, while making it clear that she was there to investigate rather than simply take orders. "I'm Supervisor Santos with Airport Security. I understand you called about a disruptive passenger, but I'm going to need to get a clear understanding of what's happening here before we take any action. Can you walk me through the situation from the beginning?" Vivian immediately launched into a breathless explanation of events that bore little resemblance to what had actually transpired, describing Jalen as aggressive and threatening, claiming that he had raised his voice and made inappropriate demands, and insisting that she had followed proper protocol in verifying his credentials before determining that his documentation was suspicious and potentially fraudulent. But Maria was watching Jalen's face as Vivian spoke, and she could see the young man's expression of quiet disbelief as he listened to a version of events that completely contradicted what had actually happened. More importantly, she was aware of the dozens of phones pointed in their direction and the fact that this entire conversation was being broadcast live to potentially millions of viewers who had witnessed the actual events and would be able to confirm or contradict whatever version of the story emerged from this investigation. Son Maria said, turning to Jalen with the kind of respectful tone that immediately conveyed that she was approaching the situation with an open mind. "I'd like to hear your version of what happened here. Can you walk me through your interaction with the lounge staff from the beginning?" Jalen took a deep breath, clearly recognizing the importance of this moment, not just for his own situation, but for the broader conversation about racial profiling and discrimination that was playing out in front of a global audience. His response was measured and precise, delivered with the kind of calm professionalism that immediately marked him as someone who was used to being in high-pressure situations and who understood the importance of maintaining his dignity regardless of how he was being treated. "I approached the reception desk approximately 20 minutes ago with a valid first-class boarding pass for Skybridge Flight 447 to London," he began, his voice clear and steady. "I politely requested access to the lounge as I'm entitled to as a first-class passenger. The manager, Ms. Blackwood, immediately refused to scan my boarding pass and instead began questioning whether my documentation was legitimate. When I offered to provide additional identification, she declined to look at it and instead made comments about security concerns and people who don't fit what she called the typical demographic profile for lounge users." As Jalen continued his account, providing specific details about each exchange and the escalating nature of Vivian's responses, Maria found herself becoming increasingly concerned about what she was hearing. The young man's version of events was not only more credible than Vivian's, but was being corroborated in real time by the passengers who had witnessed the entire interaction and were nodding in agreement as he spoke. Thomas Walsh, the retired teacher who had earlier spoken up in support of Jalen, approached Maria with the kind of authoritative presence that comes from decades of dealing with difficult situations and demanding accountability from people in positions of power. "Officer," he said, "my wife and I have been sitting over there for the past half hour, and we witnessed this entire interaction from the beginning. This young man has been nothing but polite and professional throughout this ordeal, while the manager has made increasingly inappropriate comments that can only be characterized as discriminatory. We're both retired educators, and we know discrimination when we see it." Eleanor Walsh joined her husband, carrying herself with the dignity of someone who had spent her career fighting for justice and equality in educational settings. "What we've witnessed here is a textbook example of racial profiling," she said, her voice carrying the moral authority of someone who had devoted her life to teaching young people about right and wrong. This manager made assumptions about this young man based solely on his appearance, refused to follow standard procedures that would have resolved the situation immediately, and then escalated the conflict when he refused to accept discriminatory treatment. Robert Henderson, the businessman who had initially tried to mediate the situation, approached the group with obvious frustration at how the situation had been handled. "I've been flying with Skybridge for over 20 years, he said, "and I've used this lounge hundreds of times. What I've witnessed here today is completely contrary to every standard of customer service and basic human decency that I've come to associate with this airline." This young man presented proper documentation and was treated like a criminal for no reason other than prejudice. But not all the witnesses were supportive of Jalen's position, and Maria found herself trying to sort through competing narratives as some passengers insisted that Vivian had been following proper protocol and that the situation had been blown out of proportion by people looking to create drama where none existed. The middle-aged businessman who had earlier defended Vivian's actions approached Maria with the confidence of someone who was used to having his opinions respected in business settings. "Look, officer," he said, "I don't want to get involved in some kind of political situation, but the fact is that this lounge has security protocols for a reason, and if the manager determined that additional verification was needed, then that should be the end of it. All this talk about discrimination is just an excuse to avoid following the rules that everyone else has to follow." Ashley Romano, who had been documenting the entire conversation for her live stream audience, immediately challenged the businessman's characterization of events. "Sir," she said, making sure her phone captured his response, "can you explain what security protocols require a manager to refuse to scan a valid boarding pass while making comments about demographic profiles? Because I've been traveling for years and documenting airline customer service, and I've never seen any legitimate policy that would justify what we've witnessed here today." The confrontation was becoming more complex by the minute as passengers chose sides, and Maria found herself trying to investigate a situation where the basic facts were being disputed despite the presence of multiple witnesses and extensive video documentation. She was also acutely aware that this was no longer just a routine airport security matter but had become a public relations nightmare for Skybridge Airlines that was playing out in real time before a global audience. Officer James Crawford, one of Maria's subordinates who had responded to the initial call, was growing increasingly uncomfortable as he recognized the implications of what they were being asked to handle. As a Hispanic police officer who had experienced his own share of discrimination throughout his career, he was sensitive to situations where people of color were being treated unfairly by authority figures, and everything about this situation was setting off alarm bells in his mind. Supervisor James said quietly, pulling Maria aside for a brief consultation away from the assembled crowd, "I think we need to be very careful about how we handle this. The young man doesn't appear to have violated any laws or airport regulations. The documentation he's provided appears to be legitimate, and the manager's explanation of events doesn't match what the witnesses are saying. If we arrest him or remove him based on what appears to be discriminatory treatment, we're going to be on the wrong side of a situation that's already getting national attention." Maria nodded grimly, understanding that they were facing the kind of situation that could define careers and create lasting consequences for everyone involved. She had seen too many cases where law enforcement officers had allowed themselves to be used as tools of discrimination, and she was determined not to let that happen on her watch, regardless of the pressure she might face from airline management or other authority figures. "I need to see this boarding pass and any other documentation," Maria announced to the assembled group, making it clear that she was going to conduct her own independent verification rather than simply accepting anyone's word about what was or wasn't legitimate. Jalen immediately pulled out his phone and showed her his mobile boarding pass, along with his driver's license passport and the email confirmation of his ticket purchase. Maria examined each document carefully using her own scanner to verify the barcode on the boarding pass and confirm that it was indeed valid, and that Jalen was entitled to first-class seating and lounge access. She also checked his identification against airline databases to confirm that there were no security flags or concerns associated with his name or travel history. Every check confirmed what should have been obvious from the beginning. Jalen Mitchell was a legitimate passenger who had purchased a first-class ticket and was entitled to all the services and privileges that came with that purchase. "Ma'am," Maria said, turning to Vivian with an expression that made it clear she was not pleased with what her investigation had revealed based on my review of this passenger's documentation. "Everything appears to be completely legitimate and in order. His boarding pass is valid, his identification is proper, and there are no security concerns associated with his travel profile. Can you explain to me why standard verification procedures weren't followed, and why this situation was escalated to the point where law enforcement was called?" Vivian's face had grown increasingly pale as she realized that her version of events was being demolished by an investigation that was revealing the complete lack of justification for her actions. She attempted to maintain her position by claiming that she had followed proper protocol, and that there had been legitimate security concerns that warranted additional scrutiny, but her explanations were becoming increasingly incoherent as she struggled to justify behavior that was clearly indefensible. "I was following the training we received about identifying potential security threats," she said, her voice rising with desperation. "We were told to be vigilant about passengers who might be using fraudulent documentation or who didn't fit the profile of typical first-class travelers. I was just doing my job and protecting the other passengers from potential problems." The explanation only made the situation worse, as it essentially confirmed that Skybridge Airlines had been training their employees to profile passengers based on appearance rather than following standard verification procedures that would treat all customers equally, regardless of their demographics. Ashley Romano's live stream audience was exploding with comments demanding boycotts of the airline and criminal charges against both Vivian and the company for institutionalized discrimination. Maria realized that she was dealing with a situation that went far beyond a simple customer service dispute and had revealed evidence of potential civil rights violations that would need to be investigated by federal authorities. She also understood that anything she did or didn't do at this moment would be scrutinized by millions of people who were watching the situation unfold in real time. "Mr. Mitchell," Maria said, addressing Jalen with the respect and professionalism that should have been extended to him from the beginning. "Based on my investigation, you have been subjected to discriminatory treatment that has no basis in legitimate security concerns or airline policy. You are absolutely entitled to access this lounge, and I apologize on behalf of airport security for the way this situation has been handled." She then turned to Vivian with an expression that conveyed both professional disappointment and personal disgust at what she had witnessed. "Ms. Blackwood, your treatment of this passenger appears to constitute discrimination based on race, and I will be filing a report with federal authorities regarding potential civil rights violations. I strongly recommend that you contact your supervisor and legal counsel because this situation has created liability for both you personally and for Skybridge Airlines as a company." The crowd of passengers who had been watching the entire confrontation erupted in applause and cheers as justice finally seemed to be prevailing. But everyone present understood that this was just the beginning of a much larger reckoning that would extend far beyond the walls of the Platinum Elite Lounge. The viral nature of the incident meant that Skybridge Airlines would be facing intense scrutiny of their policies and training procedures, while Vivian Blackwood would be dealing with personal and professional consequences that would likely follow her for the rest of her career. But even as Maria was attempting to resolve the immediate situation and restore some semblance of order to the lounge, none of them realized that the most dramatic moment was still to come, and that Jalen Mitchell's connection to Skybridge Airlines was about to be revealed in a way that would completely transform the nature of the confrontation and create consequences that no one present could possibly have anticipated. The sound of high heels clicking against the polished marble floor of the terminal corridor cut through the chaos in the Platinum Elite Lounge like a blade, each step measured and deliberate, carrying with it the kind of authority that comes from years of commanding respect in boardrooms and corporate environments where weakness is instantly recognized and ruthlessly exploited. The clicking grew louder as it approached the lounge entrance, and something about the rhythm and precision of those footsteps seemed to signal that the dynamics of the entire situation were about to change in ways that no one present could possibly have anticipated. Diane Mitchell had been in the middle of a high-level strategy meeting with Skybridge Airlines' European operations team when her assistant had burst into the conference room with an expression of barely controlled panic, whispering urgently into her ear about a situation involving her son that was rapidly becoming a public relations catastrophe for the company. She had excused herself from the meeting with the kind of professional composure that had served her well throughout her rise to the position of Chief Operating Officer. But inside, her maternal instincts and executive experience were both screaming that she needed to get to the Platinum Elite Lounge immediately. During the 10-minute walk from the corporate offices to the lounge, Diane had been receiving constant updates from her staff about the viral nature of the incident. The social media explosion that was already demanding corporate response, and the potential legal and public relations implications of what appeared to be a clear case of racial discrimination occurring in one of the airline's premium facilities. She had also been watching Ashley Romano's live stream on her phone, witnessing firsthand the treatment her son had been subjected to, and feeling a combination of maternal rage and professional fury that someone representing her company had behaved so egregiously. As she approached the entrance to the lounge, Diane could see through the glass doors that a crowd had gathered around the reception area, with her son standing at the center of what was clearly a highly charged confrontation. She could see airport security officers, passengers with phones recording everything, and the blonde woman who she immediately recognized as the manager, whose behavior was about to cost her career and potentially expose Skybridge Airlines to millions of dollars in legal liability. Diane paused for a moment outside the entrance, taking a deep breath and smoothing her tailored navy suit while mentally preparing for what she knew would be one of the most challenging and personally significant moments of her professional career. She was about to walk into a situation where her roles as a mother and as a corporate executive would intersect in ways that could define not only her son's future, but also her own legacy and the reputation of the company she had devoted her life to building. The conversations in the lounge began to fade as passengers noticed the striking woman in the expensive suit, who was approaching with the kind of confident stride that immediately marked her as someone of importance. There was something in her bearing, something in the way she carried herself that suggested she was used to being the most powerful person in any room she entered, and the crowd instinctively began to part as she made her way toward the reception desk where her son was still being detained. Vivian Blackwood, who had been continuing to insist to anyone who would listen that she had followed proper protocol and that the entire situation was being blown out of proportion by people looking to create controversy where none existed, suddenly found herself face to face with a woman whose presence seemed to command instant attention and respect from everyone in the vicinity. Something about the newcomer's appearance and demeanor triggered a warning in Vivian's mind, a sudden recognition that the power dynamics of the entire situation were about to shift dramatically. Ms. Blackwood Diane said, her voice carrying the kind of ice-cold authority that comes from years of making decisions that affect thousands of people and millions of dollars. "I'm Diane Mitchell, Chief Operating Officer of Skybridge Airlines. I understand you've been having some difficulty with my son." The words hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow, creating a moment of absolute silence as everyone present processed the implications of what they had just heard. Vivian's face went completely white as the reality of the situation crashed down on her like a tidal wave, and she suddenly understood that the young man she had been humiliating and discriminating against for the past hour was not just another passenger, but the son of one of the most powerful executives in the entire aviation industry. Ashley Romano's live stream exploded with comments as her viewers realized that they were witnessing what was about to become one of the most spectacular examples of instant karma ever captured on video, while her follower count jumped to over 800,000 as word spread across social media platforms that the story had taken an incredible turn that no one could have predicted. "Oh my God," Ashley whispered into her phone, her voice barely audible but clearly conveying her amazement at what was unfolding in front of her. "You guys, the plot twist of all plot twists just happened. The young man who has been discriminated against for the past hour is the son of the Chief Operating Officer of the airline. The manager who has been treating him like a criminal just called security on the boss's son. Maria Santos, the airport security supervisor who had been trying to restore order to the situation, immediately recognized the name and understood that she was now dealing with someone whose authority exceeded that of virtually anyone else at the airport. As someone who had worked in airport security for over 15 years, she was familiar with the hierarchy of airline management and knew that Diane Mitchell was one of the most powerful and respected executives in the industry. "Ma'am," Maria said, stepping forward with the kind of professional respect that she would extend to any senior airline executive, "I'm Supervisor Santos with Airport Security. I've been investigating this situation, and I want you to know that your son has conducted himself with remarkable composure and dignity throughout this entire ordeal. Based on my review of his documentation and witness statements, he has been subjected to discriminatory treatment that has no basis in legitimate security concerns or airline policy." Diane nodded acknowledgement to Maria while keeping her primary focus on Vivian, who was clearly struggling to process the magnitude of her mistake and find some way to salvage a situation that had already spiraled completely beyond her control. There was something almost pathetic about the way Vivian was looking around the room, as if searching for allies or escape routes, her earlier confidence and authority having evaporated in the face of the realization that she had just committed career suicide in the most public way possible. "Ms. Mitchell." Vivian stammered, her voice cracking with desperation as she attempted to explain her actions to someone whose authority to end her career was absolute and immediate. "I had no idea that Jalen was your son. If I had known, of course, I would have handled the situation differently. But you have to understand that we've been having security issues, and I was just following the protocols that we've been trained to implement when we encounter passengers who might be using fraudulent documentation." The explanation only made the situation worse, as it essentially confirmed that Vivian's treatment of Jalen had been based on assumptions about his appearance and background, rather than any legitimate security concerns. It also raised the disturbing implication that she would have treated him better if she had known about his family connections, which suggested that her concept of appropriate customer service was based on social status rather than basic human dignity. "Miss Blackwood Diane," said, her voice remaining perfectly controlled but carrying undertones that made it clear she was exercising enormous restraint. "Are you telling me that your decision to deny my son service and call security was based on your assessment of whether he looked like someone who belonged in this lounge and that you would have treated him differently if you had known his family background? Because if that's the case, then you've just admitted to exactly the kind of discriminatory behavior that violates both federal civil rights laws and every policy that this company has regarding equal treatment of passengers." The crowd of witnesses was hanging on every word of the exchange, understanding that they were witnessing the kind of accountability that rarely happened in real time, and that would likely be studied in business schools and diversity training programs for years to come. The viral nature of the incident meant that millions of people around the world were watching a powerful corporate executive hold her own employee accountable for discrimination against her son, creating a teachable moment about justice consequences and the importance of treating everyone with dignity regardless of their appearance or background. Jalen, who had remained remarkably composed throughout the entire ordeal, finally spoke up as he watched his mother confront the woman who had spent the past hour treating him like a criminal. "Mom," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and residual anger. "She refused to scan my boarding pass, made comments about demographic profiles, and told security that I was being aggressive and threatening when all I did was ask to be treated with basic respect. Everything she's told you about following protocol is false." Diane's expression hardened as she listened to her son's account, and those who were watching could see the controlled fury of a mother whose child had been attacked, combined with the strategic thinking of a corporate executive who understood the legal and public relations implications of what had occurred. She pulled out her phone and began scrolling through what was clearly a contacts list that included some of the most powerful people in the aviation industry. Vivian. She said her use of the woman's first name somehow managing to sound more ominous than any formal title. "I want you to understand that everything that has happened here today has been documented by multiple witnesses and broadcast live to hundreds of thousands of people around the world. Your behavior has exposed this company to potential civil rights violations, created a public relations crisis that will require significant resources to address, and most importantly, caused pain and humiliation to my son, for no reason other than your personal prejudices." She paused in her scrolling to look directly at Vivian, and the intensity of her gaze was such that several people in the crowd unconsciously took a step back. "I'm going to make 2 phone calls right now," Diane continued. "The first will be to our Human Resources Director to initiate termination proceedings against you for cause, which means you'll lose not only your job, but also your pension and benefits. The second will be to our legal department to begin an investigation into potential civil rights violations and determine what criminal charges might be appropriate in this situation." Vivian's legs nearly gave out as she realized that her 15-year career with Skybridge Airlines was ending in the most humiliating way possible, and that the consequences of her actions would likely follow her for the rest of her professional life. The aviation industry was relatively small, and word of something like this would spread quickly through professional networks, making it virtually impossible for her to find comparable employment elsewhere. "Please," Vivian begged, tears beginning to stream down her carefully made-up face. "I have a mortgage, car payments. I can't lose my job over a misunderstanding. I've been with this company for 15 years. I've never had any complaints. This was just a mistake. It wasn't personal." But Diane was already dialing her fingers, moving across her phone screen with the efficiency of someone who was used to making decisions quickly and implementing them immediately. The crowd watched in fascination as one of the most powerful executives in the airline industry took direct action to address discrimination that had occurred in her own company, creating the kind of real-time accountability that most people never got to witness. "David," Diane said into her phone, clearly speaking to someone in a position of authority. "This is Diane Mitchell. I'm standing in the Platinum Elite Lounge at Atlanta International, where one of our managers has just subjected my son to racial discrimination while refusing him service that he was entitled to as a first-class passenger. The entire incident has been captured on video and broadcast live to hundreds of thousands of viewers, and I need you to initiate immediate termination procedures for cause against Vivian Blackwood, manager of this facility." The conversation continued for several minutes as Diane provided details about the incident and coordinated the corporate response that would be necessary to address both the immediate situation and the broader implications for the company's policies and training procedures. Throughout the call, Vivian continued to plead for consideration, But her appeals fell on deaf ears as the reality of corporate accountability played out in front of the assembled witnesses. When Diane finished her call, she turned her attention to Maria Santos and the other security officers who had responded to Vivian's false report about her son being aggressive and threatening. "Officer Santos," she said, "I want to formally compliment you on your professionalism in investigating this situation and recognizing that my son was the victim, rather than the perpetrator of the problem here. However, I also want to make it clear that false police reports are a serious matter, and I expect that appropriate charges will be filed against Ms. Blackwood for misusing law enforcement resources and making false statements about my son's behavior." The implications of what had just occurred were beginning to sink in for everyone present, as they realized that they had witnessed not just an example of racial discrimination, but also the swift and decisive response of someone with the power to ensure that there were real consequences for that behavior. The viral nature of the incident meant that the story would continue to spread and generate discussion about discrimination, privilege, and accountability in ways that could influence corporate policies and social attitudes for years to come. The transformation of the Platinum Elite Lounge from a sanctuary of privilege into the epicenter of a corporate crisis was happening with breathtaking speed as Diane Mitchell's phone calls set in motion a cascade of consequences that would reshape careers, policies, and public perception in ways that no one present could have fully anticipated. Ashley Romano's live stream had exploded to over 1.2 million viewers as word spread across social media platforms that they were witnessing the real-time destruction of someone's career for discriminatory behavior, creating the kind of viral moment that defines conversations about justice and accountability in the digital age. Within minutes of Diane's first phone call, uniformed security officers began arriving at the lounge with clipboards and official-looking documents, moving with the efficiency of people who had handled corporate terminations before, but rarely under such public scrutiny. The contrast between their professional demeanor and Vivian Blackwood's increasingly desperate pleading created a stark visual representation of how quickly power dynamics could shift when behavior crossed the line from unprofessional to potentially criminal. "Ms. Blackwood," said the lead security officer, a stern-faced woman named Janet Rodriguez, who had been with Skybridge Airlines for over 20 years and had seen her share of employee misconduct cases, "I'm going to need you to surrender your company identification access cards and any other airline property in your possession. You are being terminated for cause effective immediately, and you will need to be escorted from the premises." Vivian's hands shook as she fumbled with the lanyard around her neck, struggling to remove the identification badge that had represented her authority and status for the past 15 years. The symbolic nature of that moment was not lost on anyone watching, as the piece of plastic that had given her the power to discriminate against passengers was taken away in front of the very people she had tried to humiliate and exclude. "This isn't fair," Vivian said, her voice rising to a pitch that suggested she was on the verge of a complete breakdown. "I was doing my job. I was following the training we received about security threats and suspicious behavior. You can't destroy my entire career over one mistake, over one misunderstanding that got blown out of proportion by people looking for drama." But even as she spoke, Vivian seemed to understand that her protests were futile, that the viral nature of the incident and the involvement of Diane Mitchell had created a situation where the company had no choice but to take decisive action to protect its reputation and demonstrate its commitment to equal treatment of all passengers. The footage of her behavior was already being analyzed by news outlets and civil rights organizations, creating a permanent record that would follow her for the rest of her life. Janet Rodriguez continued with the termination process, with professional efficiency, reading from a script that had clearly been used many times before, but never under such public circumstances. "Your final paycheck will be processed according to standard procedures. But please be advised that termination for cause means you forfeit all benefits, including pension contributions, health insurance continuation, and any accumulated vacation time. You will also be added to the company's Do Not Rehire list, which means you cannot be employed by Skybridge Airlines or any of its subsidiary companies in the future. The crowd of passengers watching the proceedings was transfixed by the spectacle of immediate accountability, understanding that they were witnessing something rare in American corporate culture, a powerful employee being held responsible for discriminatory behavior in real time with genuine consequences that would impact her life for years to come. The viral nature of the incident meant that this moment would be preserved forever, serving as a powerful example of what could happen when prejudice collided with power and justice. Ashley Romano continued to provide commentary for her live stream audience, her voice carrying a mixture of satisfaction and amazement at what was unfolding in front of her. "You guys, this is incredible. We're watching corporate accountability happen in real time. This manager who spent an hour humiliating and discriminating against a paying customer just lost her job, her benefits, and her pension, and it's all being documented for the world to see. This is what consequences look like when there's nowhere to hide." Meanwhile, Diane Mitchell was coordinating the broader corporate response to the crisis, speaking rapidly into her phone as she managed multiple conversations with executives, legal counsel, and public relations specialists who were scrambling to address a situation that had the potential to cause lasting damage to the airline's reputation and profitability. The stock market was already beginning to react to the viral incident, with Skybridge Airlines shares dropping as investors recognized the potential liability and public relations nightmare that the company was facing. "I want a comprehensive review of all training materials and policies related to customer service and non-discrimination," Diane said into her phone, her voice carrying the authority of someone who was used to having her directives implemented immediately and without question. "I want to know how an employee could work for this company for 15 years and still believe that racial profiling was an acceptable approach to customer service. And I want recommendations on my desk by tomorrow morning for policy changes that will prevent this from ever happening again." Officer James Crawford, the Hispanic police officer who had responded to Vivian's false report about Jalen being aggressive and threatening, was beginning to understand the legal implications of what he had witnessed and the potential charges that might be filed as a result of the false police report. As someone who had experienced discrimination himself, he was particularly disturbed by the way law enforcement had been weaponized against an innocent young man, and he was determined to ensure that appropriate charges were filed. "Ma'am," he said, approaching Diane with the kind of respectful professionalism that reflected his understanding of both her authority and the seriousness of the situation. "I want you to know that we take false police reports very seriously, especially when they involve potential civil rights violations. Based on what I've witnessed and the evidence that's been documented, we'll be filing charges against Ms. Blackwood for making false statements to law enforcement and potentially for filing a false report. There may also be federal charges related to civil rights violations." The mention of potential criminal charges seemed to push Vivian over the edge into complete panic, as she realized that the consequences of her actions might extend far beyond the loss of her job to include legal prosecution that could result in fines, imprisonment, and a permanent criminal record. The reality of what she had done was finally sinking in, and the confident authority she had displayed earlier was completely gone, replaced by the desperate pleading of someone who understood that her life was about to change dramatically for the worse. "Please," she begged, addressing her pleas to anyone who might show mercy. "I have children. I have a mortgage. I can't go to jail over this. I made a mistake, but I'm not a criminal. I'm not a racist. I was just doing what I thought was my job. You can't destroy my entire life over one bad decision." But the assembled crowd had heard her one bad decision play out over the course of an hour, had listened to her make assumptions based on race and appearance, had watched her lie to security and police about Jalen's behavior, and had seen her double down on her discrimination even when confronted with evidence that she was wrong. The idea that this was simply a mistake or misunderstanding was impossible to accept when there was so much evidence of deliberate bias and prejudice. Thomas Walsh, the retired teacher who had initially spoken up in Jalen's defense, approached Vivian with the kind of moral authority that comes from a lifetime of teaching young people about right and wrong. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying disappointment rather than anger, What you've done here today isn't the result of one bad decision. It's the culmination of years of attitudes and assumptions that allowed you to look at a young man with proper documentation and see a threat instead of a human being. The consequences you're facing aren't punishment for a mistake. They're accountability for behavior that has probably affected many other people who didn't have the resources or support to fight back. Eleanor Walsh joined her husband, her expression reflecting the sadness of someone who had spent decades fighting against exactly this kind of discrimination in educational settings. "We've taught thousands of students over the years," she said, "and we've seen how prejudice and assumptions can crush young people's spirits and limit their opportunities. What you did to Jalen today was wrong, and the fact that it took his mother's position of power to get justice shows how many other victims of discrimination never get the accountability they deserve." The moral weight of the Walsh's words seemed to impact even some of the passengers who had initially supported Vivian's position, as they began to understand that the discrimination they had witnessed wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of behavior that had likely affected many other travelers who didn't have the connections or resources to demand better treatment. Robert Henderson, the businessman who had challenged Vivian's behavior from the beginning, was using his own phone to document the corporate response and the immediate consequences that were unfolding in front of them. As someone who traveled extensively for business and held status with multiple airlines, he understood the broader implications of what had occurred and the potential impact on the industry's approach to customer service and discrimination. "What we're witnessing here," he said, speaking to his own social media followers, "is proof that discrimination still exists in premium travel spaces, but also evidence that there can be real consequences when it's documented and brought to public attention. This should serve as a wake-up call for the entire aviation industry about the need to train employees properly and hold them accountable when they fail to treat all passengers with dignity and respect." Maria Santos was coordinating with other airport security personnel to ensure that the incident was properly documented and that all relevant evidence was preserved for potential legal proceedings. As someone who had worked in airport security for over 15 years, she understood the importance of maintaining detailed records when civil rights violations were involved, and she wanted to make sure that nothing was overlooked that might be relevant to federal investigators. "We're going to need statements from all witnesses," she announced to the assembled crowd, "and I want to make sure everyone understands that this incident will be thoroughly investigated by both local law enforcement and federal authorities. If you witnessed any part of what happened here today, please provide your contact information so that investigators can follow up with you if necessary." The professional manner in which Maria handled the situation stood in stark contrast to Vivian's increasingly desperate behavior, highlighting the difference between someone who understood their responsibility to serve the public fairly and someone who had allowed personal bias to override their professional obligations. The crowd's respect for Maria was evident in the way they responded to her requests, understanding that she was committed to ensuring that justice was served. As Vivian was escorted from the lounge by security personnel, her career and reputation in ruins, the passengers who remained began to process what they had witnessed and its broader implications for society and corporate accountability. The viral nature of the incident meant that the story would continue to spread and generate discussion about discrimination, privilege, and the importance of documenting injustice when it occurs in public spaces. Jalen, who had maintained his composure throughout the entire ordeal, was finally able to relax as the immediate threat to his safety and dignity was removed. But even as he appreciated the support of the witnesses and the swift action of his mother and the airline, he understood that this incident would follow him for years to come, serving as both a reminder of the discrimination he still faced and an example of how that discrimination could be challenged when people with power chose to use it responsibly. The Platinum Elite Lounge slowly began to return to some semblance of normalcy as the crowd dispersed and passengers returned to their conversations and travel preparations, but everyone present understood that they had witnessed something significant that would influence their own attitudes and behaviors in future situations where they might encounter discrimination or injustice. 6 months after the confrontation that had transformed a routine request for lounge access into a global conversation about racial profiling and corporate accountability. The reverberations of that afternoon at Atlanta International Airport continued to shape lives, policies, and public discourse in ways that demonstrated the lasting power of documented truth in an age of viral media and instant justice. Jalen Mitchell stood at the podium in the packed auditorium at Cambridge University, looking out at an audience of students, faculty, and civil rights advocates who had come to hear him speak about dignity, justice, and the responsibility that comes with privilege and education. At 19, he had grown into his role as an unexpected spokesperson for travelers' rights and had used his experience to launch the Sterling Foundation for Travel Equity, an organization dedicated to providing legal support and advocacy for passengers who face discrimination in airports, hotels, and other travel-related businesses around the world. When I walked into that lounge 6 months ago, Jalen said, his voice carrying the confidence and authority that comes from surviving public humiliation and emerging stronger. I was just a teenager trying to get from Atlanta to London for a university interview. I had no idea that asking to be treated with basic human dignity would become a viral moment that would change my life and the lives of everyone involved. But what I learned from that experience is that individual acts of courage, even when they're not planned or intended, can create ripples that extend far beyond anything you could have imagined. The audience listened intently as he described the months that followed the incident. The media attention that had been both overwhelming and empowering, and the way he had chosen to channel his anger and frustration into positive action that could help other travelers who might face similar discrimination. He spoke about the dozens of cases the foundation had already taken on, from a Hispanic family denied hotel accommodations to an elderly Sikh man subjected to additional security screening based on his appearance, and the satisfaction that came from turning his own painful experience into a tool for broader social change. The most important thing I learned, Jalen continued, is that dignity is not something that can be granted or taken away by other people. It's something you carry within yourself, something that remains intact regardless of how others choose to treat you. But dignity without justice is incomplete, and justice without consequences is meaningless. What happened to me that day mattered not because I was the son of a powerful executive, but because every human being deserves to be treated with respect regardless of their background, their appearance, or their family connections. Meanwhile, in a small apartment in Queens that she could barely afford on her minimum wage salary from a late-night diner, Vivian Blackwood was watching Jalen's speech on her laptop, her face etched with the kind of exhaustion that comes from months of unemployment, legal battles, and social isolation. The woman who had once commanded respect and authority as manager of one of the most exclusive airline lounges in the country now worked graveyard shifts, serving coffee and cleaning tables, her fall from grace complete and seemingly irreversible. The criminal charges against her had been resolved through a plea agreement that included community service and sensitivity training, but the civil lawsuit filed by Diane Mitchell on behalf of her son had resulted in a substantial financial settlement that had forced Vivian into bankruptcy. More devastating than the financial consequences, however, was the social isolation that had followed her viral infamy, as friends and family members distanced themselves from someone whose name had become synonymous with workplace discrimination and racial prejudice. As she watched Jalen speak about dignity and justice, Vivian found herself confronting the reality of what her assumptions and prejudices had cost not only him but herself and her own children, who had been subjected to harassment and social ostracism as a result of her actions. The confidence and authority she had once possessed had been replaced by a constant awareness that she was one internet search away from being recognized as the woman who had called police on an innocent teenager for the crime of existing in a space where she had decided he didn't belong. The transformation of Skybridge Airlines in response to the incident had been swift and comprehensive, with Diane Mitchell personally overseeing a complete overhaul of customer service training and discrimination prevention policies that had become a model for the broader aviation industry. The company had implemented mandatory bias training for all customer-facing employees, installed enhanced surveillance systems in premium facilities to ensure accountability, and created new procedures for handling discrimination complaints that emphasized investigation and resolution rather than dismissal and cover-up. We learned that our previous approach to customer service training was inadequate. Diane had told a congressional hearing on discrimination in the travel industry 3 months after the incident. We had focused on technical procedures and corporate policies without addressing the unconscious biases that can influence how those policies are implemented. The result was a structure that allowed individual prejudices to override our stated commitment to equal treatment of all passengers. The hearing had been one of several that followed the viral incident as lawmakers and advocacy groups used the documented evidence of discrimination to push for broader reforms in how the travel industry trained employees and handled complaints. Jalen's testimony before Congress had been particularly powerful as he described not only his own experience, but the dozens of similar cases that the Sterling Foundation had documented, creating a comprehensive picture of how discrimination continued to affect travelers of color despite legal protections and corporate diversity statements. Ashley Romano had parlayed her documentation of the incident into a career as a social justice advocate and documentary filmmaker, using her expanded platform of over 5 million followers to highlight cases of discrimination and injustice across various industries. Her film about the airport incident, Dignity Denied: The True Cost of Prejudice, had won several awards and had been used in corporate training programs and college courses as an example of how individual actions could create widespread change when properly documented and publicized. What made this case different, Ashley explained in interviews about her work, wasn't that discrimination happened. That happens every day to people who don't have powerful family members or viral video coverage. What made it different was that all the elements came together to create accountability documentation, witnesses willing to speak up, corporate leadership willing to take action, and a victim who had the resources and support to demand justice, rather than simply accepting mistreatment. Maria Santos had been promoted to Chief of Airport Security Operations, her professional handling of the incident and commitment to fair investigation having earned recognition from both her superiors and civil rights organizations. She had used her new position to implement training programs that emphasized the difference between legitimate security concerns and discriminatory profiling, creating protocols that protected both passenger rights and genuine safety requirements. Officer James Crawford had become an advocate for police reform within his own department, using his experience as a witness to discrimination to push for better training on civil rights issues and the appropriate response to complaints that might be motivated by bias rather than legitimate security concerns. His testimony about how law enforcement could be manipulated into enforcing discrimination had been particularly influential in discussions about police accountability and community relations. The elderly couple, Thomas and Eleanor Walsh, had become unexpected advocates for civil rights, using their experience as witnesses to speak at community events and educational forums about the importance of bystander intervention when discrimination occurs in public spaces. Their moral authority as retired educators had given weight to their message that remaining silent in the face of injustice makes everyone complicit in perpetuating structures that harm vulnerable individuals. "We spent our careers teaching young people about right and wrong," Eleanor had said in a speech to a group of retired teachers, and what we witnessed that day reminded us that education doesn't end when you leave the classroom. Every time we see someone being treated unfairly and choose to speak up, we're teaching a lesson about what kind of society we want to live in. Robert Henderson had used his business connections and frequent traveler status to push for industry-wide reforms in customer service training and complaint handling, working with airline executives and travel industry associations to develop best practices that would prevent discrimination and ensure accountability when it occurred. His insider knowledge of the premium travel experience had made him an effective advocate for changes that would protect all passengers, while maintaining the quality of service that business travelers expected. As Jalen concluded his speech at Cambridge, he reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought him from a humiliating confrontation in an airport lounge to a position where he could advocate for justice and dignity for travelers around the world. The experience had been painful and traumatic, but it had also revealed the power that comes from refusing to accept discrimination and the importance of using privilege and platform responsibly when fighting for widespread change. The woman who discriminated against me lost her career, her reputation, and her financial security, Jalen said in closing. But punishment is not the same as justice. Justice means creating a world where what happened to me doesn't happen to others. It means building structures that protect dignity rather than destroying it. And it means understanding that each of us has a responsibility to stand up for what's right, whether we're the victim, the witness, or the person with power to create change. The lasting impact of that afternoon in the Platinum Elite Lounge had extended far beyond the individuals directly involved, creating conversations about unconscious bias, corporate accountability, and the responsibility of bystanders to intervene when they witness injustice. The viral nature of the incident had demonstrated the power of social media to create immediate consequences for discriminatory behavior, while also highlighting the ongoing need for education policy reform and cultural change in addressing prejudice and discrimination in American society. In the end, what had started as a simple request for lounge access had become a powerful reminder that dignity is not negotiable, that justice requires action rather than just intention, and that even in spaces designed to exclude and discriminate, truth and accountability can ultimately prevail when people choose courage over comfort and action over silence. What did you think about this incredible story of instant karma? Was the punishment for Vivian and the officers involved enough, or did they deserve even worse consequences? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one and love hearing your perspectives on these real-life justice stories. If this story of standing up to discrimination moved you, please hit that like button to help more people see this important message about dignity and respect. Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that treating people with basic human decency isn't optional. It's a requirement for living in a civilized society. And don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss our weekly uploads of real-life drama stories where justice prevails and people get exactly what they deserve. Until next time, remember to stay humble, treat everyone with respect, and never underestimate the power of standing up for what's right. I'll see you in the next one.